Breland Sharn. The trip to the tavern had done one thing. It had taken Lay's mind off of her own misfortune. Lay was full of questions as the trio headed back to High Walls, while Pierce was, if anything, quieter than usual.
Do you suppose these Tarkanans could have killed his hippogriffs? Maybe they'd been hired by one of these opposing beast groups, and he was trying to find out who was behind it.
Possibly, Dane said. That, or he knew who killed his mounts and thought that the Tarkanans could help him get revenge on the killers. I suppose that finding the Tarkanans is the next step.
It sounds dangerous.
This from a woman who fought 300 Warforged.
Do you have an army that I don't know about?
Good point. Still, there's something that's bothering me.
What's that?
She was momentarily distracted by a small tower up the street. It appeared to be formed from overlapping steel plates. Alina implied that Raciel served her as a smuggler, bringing in contraband through the air. So if he was still flying, if he was still in Sharn, why'd he quit racing?
Perhaps he was still trying to find out who sabotaged his earlier bouts, Lay said. He didn't dare return until he identified his foe.
It's possible. But he was a member of the Sharn Watch. Why would he turn to a group of assassins instead of the forces of the law? Why would they have anything to do with him?
I don't know.
They walked a ways in silence, eventually reaching the lift. 3 other people boarded the lift with them. Beggars, by the look, dressed in worn cloaks and tatters. There was a muscular half-orc, a tall, lean man, and a young halfling woman. As the lift began to fall, something about the halfling caught Dane's eye. She was covered with dirt, and her cloak was torn wool. At a glance, she seemed like any of the hundreds of beggars Dane had seen over the years. But as he watched, a rat came crawling out of the folds of her cloak and climbed up toward her face. It chittered and squeaked, and she whispered quietly to it. Dane remembered the rat he'd seen in The King of Fire, and a chill ran down his spine. Looking up, Dane saw that the thin man had moved closer to him. Beneath the hood of his cloak, the stranger's face was horribly disfigured, scarred by pustules and the ravages of disease. His robes carried a sweet odor of rot and decay. He looked down at Dane and spoke in a deep, rasping voice.
You have information I require, Mona.
The stranger seemed quite confident, considering that both he and his companions were completely unarmed. Dane put his hand on the hilt of his sword, making the motion as obvious as possible. And you are?
I am Bal of the House of Tarkanan, and you will tell me what I wish to know, or you will not leave this lift alive.
I guess that takes care of our next step, Lay said.
Is this going to happen every time we get on a lift? Because I may start taking the stairs. He drew his sword, but kept the point to the side. Now, shall we start this conversation again?
I believe that we shall.
Bal spun forward in a blur of motion. Before Dane even realized what was happening, the rotting man smashed Dane's hand with a powerful kick. The sword went spinning through the air and came to a halt against the railing. Bal drew his cracked lips back from decaying teeth.
Shall we begin?
Dane nodded. He cursed himself for underestimating his foe. but he could see the same overconfidence in Bal. All right, let's see if we can't shed some light on things. Lay slipped her hand into her belt pouch, obviously catching Dane's signal. She pulled a golden spear from her pouch and flung it between the halfling and the half-orc. Both cried out as a cloud of blinding golden particles engulfed them. Pierce drew his long flail from his back. As he shook the chain free from the haft, he sent Dane's sword spinning across the lift with a well-placed kick. Dane knelt and caught the sword with his right hand, drawing his dagger with his left. He rose to his feet and leveled his sword at the chest of his foe. All right, let's talk. Bal came forward again, moving with eerie speed and grace, but this time Dane was prepared. He ducked out of the way and drew a long, shallow cut along his enemy's shin.
You have no idea what you're dealing with,
Bal hissed through gritted teeth, slipping past Dane's guard as if he were a ghost. The rotting man pressed the palm of his right hand against Dane's throat. Suddenly, ice was flowing through Dane's blood. Chills ran along every nerve, and it was all that he could do to stay on his feet. He made a weak thrust, but Bal slipped under the blow. The next thing Dane knew, he was on the floor of the lift with Bal standing above him. The pain grew worse. He could see Pierce standing over the fallen body of the half-orc, with Lay and the rat girl beyond.
Hold!
Bal called out in a voice like a winter wind.
If I touch your friend again, he will die.
Lay froze. Pierce kept the chain of his flail spinning, forming a singing web of steel, but he did not strike. Should I shatter your comrade's head, he said, I suspect that he will also die. His voice was calm and collected. There was a moment of tension that seemed to last for an eternity, and then Bal laughed, a long, dry rasp.
True enough.
He stepped back.
I apologize for my uncalled-for aggression. Perhaps we can help each other.
Behind him the half-orc moaned and brought a hand to his head. Dane rose to his feet. He was dizzy and nauseous, but the pain seemed to be subsiding. What do you want? He growled.
We are looking for Racial. Zay.
He nodded toward the halfling, who was rubbing her eyes and glaring at Lay.
Heard you mention him. I've never seen you before. How do you know him?
The lift was approaching the ground. I think I'd like to hear your story before I say much more. I know an inn not far from here. Can I offer you a cup of tall? Bal glanced at his comrades. The rat girl huddled in the corner and the warrior stretched out on the floor.
Perhaps that would be for the best.
The half-orc whom Bal called Corlan split off from the group after they arrived in High Walls. Apparently, he had a personal errand to attend to. Zay and Bal accompanied the trio to the Manticore. The other patrons quickly dispersed once Bal entered the common room, though Dane couldn't say whether it was due to a sinister reputation or simply his diseased appearance. The innkeeper grumbled, but once Dane gave her a few crowns, she quickly returned with a pot of steaming tall. Little Zay ducked under a table and watched them. 2 rats emerged from the folds of her cloak, and their movements mirrored her own.
Chew this,
Bal said, handing Dane a dried leathery leaf.
It will help with the symptoms.
Dane considered the leaf and finally began to chew. The worst it could do was kill him, and with the way he was feeling, that might be a relief. Though he hadn't gotten any worse since they'd left the lift, he was still feeling dizzy and weak. What did you do to me? He asked. Bal took a slow sip of tall, watching Dane closely.
The chilling touch is my inheritance. It is a gift that I share with Raciel Tarkanen.
Tarkanen,
Lay breathed in sharply.
you're Aberrants.
She pushed her chair back from the table.
I am blessed, child of Canith.
Bal said. His voice was level, but his eyes glittered.
Shall we compare the power of our gifts?
Zay giggled in the shadows of the table, her rats chittering beside her.
Lay,
Dane barked. Calm down. What are you talking about? Lay took a deep breath and pulled her chair back up to the table. What do you know about the War of the Mark? Dane shrugged.
Hallis Tarkanen was the mightiest of the Aberrant lords. When the pure line sought to cleanse the darkness, it was Tarkanen who organized those who bore aberrant marks into an army.
Bal showed his teeth.
cleanse the darkness. A pleasant way to talk about murder.
Lay glared at him, and for a moment Dane thought she was about to draw a weapon.
The aberrant marks are dangerous to body and soul. Fire, darkness, death. These are not forces the living were meant to channel.
And yet we do. You fear what you cannot control. You build, I destroy.
Enough, said Dane. The pieces were beginning to come together. You said we could help each other. What is it you want?
Raciel is one of us, and he's missing. He returned to the city 2 days ago, but in that time he hasn't been seen. We are concerned that he has placed himself in danger, and we wish to find him before he is harmed.
Dane wished Jode was around. Reading faces wasn't his specialty. Why do you think he'd be in danger?
Raciel was working in the shadows. We know he wasn't telling us about some of his activities. We have our suspicions, which leads me to ask, why are you looking for him?
We were hired by the Windguard of Dagger Watch. They want him back for the upcoming race, and no one knows where he went. Dane had spent the last 10 minutes coming up with this story, and he cursed Jode for not being around. Lying was not something Dane did well.
Dagger Watch?
Bal considered this.
So, the guardsmen of Daggerwatch hired a group of mourners to do their work.
Damn, Dane thought. If only they'd had time to buy new clothes. Lay spoke before he could answer.
I believe they gave us the job on my account, she said. I may be from the Mornland, but I am of Canith, first and foremost. And I am of an age to be betrothed. I believe the commander hoped to win my favor by offering this work to my friends. And to be honest, I believe that he enjoys ordering a former Syrian captain about like a paid dog.
Bal nodded slowly.
I suppose he might, at that. But Raciel won't be coming back to your employers. Raciel Tan is dead. He is Raciel Tarkanen now, and his place is with us.
I understand, Dane said. But surely, you understand that the longer we continue the investigation, the longer we get paid. Perhaps we can help you. We're new in the city, and we could use a few friends. If we discover any more information, I'd be willing to pass it along, for the proper considerations. There was a pause as Bal drank the last of his towel. Finally, he set the mug down.
Very well, mourner. Prove your worth. You can contact me through the Ilian apothecary in Dragon Towers.
He pushed back his chair and stood up. Beneath her table, Zay was carrying on a quiet, animated discussion with two rats and a mouse. In unison, the rodents disappeared into the folds of her cloak. "Before you go," Dane said, "is there anything you can tell us that could help us find him?" Val paused. "I believe he was dealing with someone in this district, but I don't know who." He nodded to Zay, and they moved for the door. "Perhaps we'll meet again, mourner. Next time, I'd think carefully before you draw your weapon." Dane stared at him, face grim. "Next time, surprise won't be on your side." The rotting man held his gaze for a moment, then left without a word. Dassy the innkeeper finally broke the long silence that followed.
Good to see the back of that one, General. I'm sure you saw worse in your day, but I certainly didn't like the looks of him. Why don't I get you another cup of towel, and you can tell us the story about the Olaran orphanage again?"
They nodded and smiled, though inside he was cursing all lying halflings. It was not long before Jode returned. The four retired to their room, and Dane recounted the events of the last 2 hours. "Aberrant dragon marks. Interesting," Jode said, rubbing his own dragon mark thoughtfully.
Disturbing,
Lay said. "There's one thing I don't understand about this," Dane said. "I've heard of aberrant dragon marks, but in the stories I've heard, the people with these black marks sour milk or scare dogs, that sort of thing. Killing with a touch is a far cry from making paint peel. How come I haven't heard about this before?"
most of the aberrants were wiped out over 1,000 years ago. These days, they usually only appear when two people from different dragon-marked houses have a child together. Instead of possessing the mark of either house, the child may develop a warped, damaged mark, usually with a weak power, or no power at all. The common theory is that the damaged mark reflects damage to the soul of the bearer, and those who bear aberrant marks often go mad. Or so I've heard. That's why the dragon-marked houses aren't supposed to mingle their blood.
Killing with a touch doesn't strike me as a weak power. "I met a man with an aberrant mark once," Jode interjected. "He had a chilling touch, much as you described. An unpleasant fellow. No question there. But I wouldn't think he'd have been able to take you down, Dane."
I know.
Lay paused and thought for a moment.
There is one other possibility, but it's just a legend.
Dane shrugged. "Tell me the story then."
The War of the Mark established the 12 dragon-marked houses that exist today. Supposedly, the houses came together to put an end to aberrant marks, to prevent crossbreeding, and to destroy those already tainted by the darkness.
"So I've gathered."
All we have to work with now is legend and hearsay. But according to the tales, the aberrant dragon marks possessed by Lord Tarkanan and his allies were not weak, damaged marks. They would spread plagues, call fire from the sky, break the earth with tremors, and far worse. But the human mind and body were not made to channel these dark powers, and the marks drove their bearers to madness, or caused them to grow ill and die.
Which would explain the walking boil and the girl who spends more time talking to rats than people.
It's just a theory.
Lay paused, considering.
I've also heard of a substance called dragon's blood, which increases the power of a dragon mark for a brief period of time. I imagine It would work on an aberrant mark just as it would on a true mark.
And don't forget Korolev, Jode said, referring to a sorcerer who had served with them for a few months during the war. While he had no dragon mark, Korolev had learned to manipulate mystical energy to produce a wide range of effects. He claimed to be one of the teeth of Eberron, and had been quite useful before the Valanar killed him. Dane shook his head. Fine. Maybe they're drug-addled aberrations. Maybe they're sorcerers. So just don't let them touch you. Let's focus on Raciel. Did you find anything useful, Jode?
Raciel was well-liked. Honest, by all accounts. Had a real knack for working with hippogriffs and a lot of friends in the local enclave of House Vidalis. Racing and flying were both passions of his. All in all, he was handsome, talented, popular, a rising star. Then he suffered those 2 accidents. A week later, he vanished. No one has seen him since. With that said, there were a few guards who weren't telling the whole truth, and not the nicest bunch. Raciel may have been honest to begin with, but I think he's been dealing with these Tarkanians recently, probably to help hide his smuggling activities.
Dane nodded. So the real question is why? Why does a successful, honest man throw away everything he has and turn to the other side of the law?
Maybe he didn't have a choice, Blaze said. The others turned and looked at her. Think about it, Jode. Dragon marks. Pure dragon marks don't appear at birth. They appear late in life, usually triggered by stress. If Raciel really had this chilling touch, what if it first manifested during the race of 8 winds? What if he killed his mount?
Jode nodded.
He gets excited during the races. His mount dies. That would be a dilemma. He could have joined the Tarkanians to learn about his mark.
And from the sound of it, once you sign up, you're in for life. But there are still a few loose ends. I don't think the Tarkanians know about the connection between Raciel and Alina, and we'd better keep it that way. But what was Raciel doing for Alina? Why did he betray her? And who is he dealing with now? What is he hiding from the Tarkanians, and where is he?
All good questions, Jode said. But as I recall, we're supposed to meet Counselor Terrell for dinner at the 7th bell.
And, Dane said. Outside, the 7th bell rang. Jode smiled.
Shall we be off to dinner, Lord Dane?
Interlude. Corlan hated Sharn. He was a child of the deep swamps, and he missed the tranquility of his homeland. The nights spent alone with the sounds of shadow toads, water, crickets, the wind in the rushes. The towers of Sharn were unnatural, and the constant babble of voices was a constant assault on his ears. He hated the mobs of people, eyes everywhere he looked, watching him, shouting and squabbling, filling the air with noise and stench. But the marshes were no longer his home. When he was 10, the mark had appeared. The fire flowed in his blood, threatening to consume his spirit if he did not grant it a release. In a moment of madness, he had killed his brother with a gout of fire that burst forth from his hands. That was all it took. He was driven from the marches, tainted and touched by the deep worm, and if he returned to his family, they would do their best to kill him. For a time, he wandered, feverish and dazed, through the western plains, and then the Tarkanians had found him and taught him to control his gift. He hated Sharn, but it was the home of his true family, It was the only place he would ever belong. Corlan had the pink skin of a Berlander, but his muscular physique and fiery temper hinted at his inhuman ancestry, and oversized canine teeth protruded from his lips when he was angry. Today, his fangs were in full view. Baal had said that intimidation would be the best approach, and Corlan wanted to get this over with quickly, so he could return to his quiet room in Dragon Towers. There was a guard in front of the tent flap, but Corlan had grown up hunting dusk wisps, and it was a simple matter to slip through the shadows without being seen. A single powerful blow was all it took to send the guard to the ground in a crumpled heap. His target was already waiting for him when he stepped inside the tent. The man appeared to be unarmed, but Corlan was well aware of how deceiving appearances could be. Corlan concentrated, and there was a moment of terrible pain as the blood in his veins burned with a terrible heat. He focused the pain on his palm, and flames flickered around his fingers. "I'm here for Raciel Tarkanen," Corlan said, glaring down at his enemy. "You will tell me where he is, and you will tell me what dealings you have had with him."
"I'm afraid I have other plans."
It was difficult to read the man's expression. His face was a horrid mask of raw, wet muscle, and his eyes were sunk deep within his sockets. If he was afraid of Corlan and the flames, he did not show it. "It wasn't a request," Corlan said. He couldn't unleash the full force of his burning hands without setting the tent alight, but he'd found that his fiery touch had a way of changing opinions, and he reached for the flayed man's shoulder. The man moved with astonishing speed, darting down and slamming into Corlan. He was unnaturally strong for his size, and Corlan was thrown back against the side of the tent. Snarling, he rose to his feet, intending to release the full fire he held within. Baal had wanted answers, but there would be other sources. But as he raised his burning hands, there was a blur before him. His enemy's tongue snapped out of his mouth, stretching across the space between them. Pain stabbed his throat, and as the tongue withdrew, Corlan saw a vicious bar protruding from the tip. A cold chill spread across his body, numbing his nerves and extinguishing the flames. His legs refused to respond to his brain, and he fell. Within seconds, he was completely paralyzed, unable to do anything but watch as his foe came toward him.
"I am pleased to see that Raciel's former friends are looking for him,"
the skinless man said. Corlan could not even cringe as the man produced a long knife. With one smooth motion, the stranger cut open Corlan's jerkin, revealing his torso and the aberrant mark that covered his left breast.
"Lovely."
The man smiled, revealing a mouth filled with bloody teeth. He stepped out of Corlan's field of vision. Corlan heard others enter the tent, but he couldn't turn his head to look.
"Take him below,"
the man said. He came back into view, leering at Corlan with his ruined face.
"I'm afraid I have business elsewhere, but my associates will see that you are reunited with young Raciel. I thank you for your contribution to our cause."
Chapter 17. In the early days of Sharn, Togran Square had been a center for commerce. The tents of merchants from across Corvair and more exotic lands had filled the open plaza. The plaza was still filled with tents, but the richly decorated cloth had been replaced by patched oilskin. There were hundreds of Syrian refugees in the city, and many of them lived in this makeshift village. After the destruction of Syr, Berland was the only nation that agreed to provide shelter to the refugees. And many Syrians had made the long journey south in hopes of reconnecting with relatives that had been established in Sharn before the war. They'd arrived to find that Syrians and other non-Brelish citizens had been relocated to the ghetto of high walls and stripped of their livelihood. Like Dane, most of these refugees arrived in Sharn with only the clothes on their backs. In this tent town, nobles and peasants were all alike. Dozens of people studied Dane as he made his way to the large black tent in the center of the square. Some nodded respectfully, but an equal number seemed sullen or even resentful.
"Not what I'd call a hero's welcome," Jode observed.
"Do you see any heroes?" Dane looked into the eyes of the angry refugees and wondered where they had been 3 years ago, what war had stolen from each of them. "We lost." Jode wore his one piece of festive attire, a jaunty burgundy flat cap embroidered with a spiderweb pattern portrayed in a rainbow of colors. In addition to adding a touch of flair to his drab military leather, the cap hid his dragon mark from view.
"It looks like all the good spaces have been taken,"
he said, studying the tents.
"I was hoping to get a good view of one of the rubbish fires when we set up our tent of our own."
Jode was trying to make light of the situation, but he had a point. Unless they've completed the job for Alina, they might be living here in a week. "If we must, we can pawn something else," Dane said. His dagger, Lay's pack. They had a few valuable items left, even if Dane hated the idea of putting these treasures at risk.
"You have to wonder, though," said Jode. "If we were to buy a tent of our own, what's to stop us from getting a black one? And if we get a black tent, Counselor Terrell couldn't tell people to come to the black tent. Do you think he'd do something about it?"
As it turns out, Terrell's tent was difficult to miss. Color aside, it towered over the surrounding tents, and the flag of Syr was flying from the central post. A squat, balding dwarf stood by the entrance. He bowed as he approached and opened the flap. "Terrell is expecting you," he said. Cloth walls divided the interior into rooms. The entry chamber seemed to double as a dining hall and servants' quarters, and tattered bedrolls were stacked against the walls. A low round table dominated the center of the room, and 6 people were already seated on the floor around it. Terrell, an old half-elven woman with a child, 2 young men who appeared to be identical twins, and a woman in her 30s who wore a patch over one eye. Counselor Terrell rose to his feet and slowly made his way around the table, leaning on a gnarled cane.
"Ah, Captain Dane. You are welcome in my house."
Age and injury had both taken their toll on the former counselor. He favored his right foot, and the tip of a large puckered scar could be seen at the left side of his throat. Despite these infirmities, he moved with calm confidence, and his voice was warm and soothing. Jode stepped forward and bowed.
"Truly, the honor is ours,"
he smiled as he rose.
"But I have to ask, do you really call it a house? Home is certainly a broad term. I've seen homes that really were just holes in a wall, but somehow I've always thought that it wasn't a house if you could cut through the walls."
Dane reached down and grabbed Jode's collar, yanking him back. "I trust you remember Jode, my healer? As he said, it is we who are honored by the invitation, Lord Earsaurus."
"Please, Dane. Just Terrell. I have no estates anymore, and we are all equals in this community.
Except your servants, Jode said, as a young woman emerged from one of the flaps with bread for the table. Dane gave him a rap on the head. My apologies.
No, it's a simple misunderstanding. There are no servants here. I am an old man, but there are those who respect what I have done for Seer in the past, and my attempts to unify the survivors today. I don't know what I would do without Eulalia, Karis, and the others.
He smiled at the young woman, who inclined her head and disappeared into the back of the tent. Despite Terrell's reassurances, she did not speak, and she avoided eye contact with the visitors. Terrell shuffled back to the table and sat down.
Now, please, join us and introduce yourselves. I try to dine with different people each night. Our people are all that remains of our proud nation, and we must come together if we are going to survive.
Dane sat next to Terrell, and the other soldiers spread around the table. Pierce stood behind Dane. I have no need of sustenance, he said. I prefer to stand. The other guests glanced at one another. That's fine, Dane said, bowing his head slightly. He continued, This is my comrade Pierce, who served our nation as a scout and skirmisher. I am Dane, and until the tragedy, I held the rank of captain in the Southern Command. The one-eyed woman sitting to Terrell's left smiled at that. She appeared to be slightly older than Dane. Her golden brown hair was tied back in a long ponytail that fell down to her hips. A maze of fine scars ran back to her torn right ear. She was dressed in a brown blouse and breeches, patched with green cloth.
And do you have a family name, Captain Dane?
I prefer Dane.
Who wouldn't?
Terrell nodded toward the woman.
Greykel was also an officer of the Southern Command. Perhaps you two know each other.
Dane studied the woman. She grinned, and then it came to him. The Laughing Wolf?
I prefer Greykel,
she said, her smile widening. Born to one of the lesser noble families of Seer, she was one of the few female captains in the Southern Command and was known for her brilliantly unorthodox strategies, dogged tenacity, and ability to inspire her troops. Some said she showed too much mercy to the enemy, but mercy had always been a Seeran virtue, and the queen had praised her behavior. She rubbed her chin thoughtfully, studying Dane in return.
Let's see. Dane, you fought on the Valanar front, didn't you? And what was it I'd heard? Before you joined the guard, you...
Could I get something to drink? Dane said. I'm parched.
My apologies, said Terrell.
He clapped his hands and the server returned, carrying a clay pitcher.
I'm afraid we only have water, Captain. My table is a humble one.
Company matters more than the mead, Dane said. The serving girl carefully filled his cup with water. She seemed to be trembling slightly. Is something wrong? He asked. Terrell touched the girl's arm and she flinched, almost dropping the pitcher. She made no sound.
Eulalia has suffered grievously these last few years. She lived in the village of Cariol. Have you heard of it? It was captured by the Darguls a little over 2 years ago, and she and her family were taken. After the disaster struck, she escaped into the ruins of Seer, and I found her there when I was searching for survivors. It's been hard to tell what was done by the goblins and what happened to her in the Mournland. But I know she had to watch her brothers die, and
He took her hand, but she kept her eyes down on the floor.
show them, Eulalia,
He said gently. Slowly, Eulalia looked up. She pulled back her lips, and Jode gasped. Eulalia's teeth and gums were sculpted from black marble. The two fair-haired twins sitting across the table laughed, but Greykel glared at them, and they fell silent.
What?
Said Dane.
Her mouth has been turned to stone,
Terrell explained.
teeth, gums, tongue, and much of the muscle. She can open her mouth just enough to drink. Terrible, I know, but fascinating, don't you think?
How did this happen? Dane said. Eulalia looked away and kept her silence. Her skin was even paler than Lay's, and she had short black hair and dark eyes. Strangely, Dane found himself thinking that her teeth matched her eyes.
I don't know for certain, Terrell said. She can't speak, and as far as I know, she's illiterate. My thought was some sort of torture. Cockatrice blood activated through sorcery and dripped in the mouth, but it could have just been some effect of the Mournland itself.
They nodded. They had seen strange and terrible things during the time they spent in Seer, far worse than a stone tongue. She'd been lucky. I'm sorry to hear, he said to her, but I'm glad that you're alive. Eulalia refused to meet his gaze.
You may go,
Terrell said, and she returned to the kitchen without looking back. There was a moment of silence following Eulalia's departure. Then Terrell broke one of the loaves of bread and passed it around.
You'll see far worse sights here, I'm afraid, he said quietly. Many of those caught in the wake of the mourning suffered in some way, either in mind or body.
His eyes dipped toward his injured leg and his scar.
I was one of the lucky ones. I think the mourning is the best thing that could have happened to us,
said one of the twins. The two men across the table appeared to be identical. Both were humans in their late 20s, dressed in identical drab green clothes. Lanky blonde hair fell to their shoulders, but what caught Dane's attention were the speaker's eyes. They were the palest shade of blue he'd ever seen, and the man never blinked.
And I think you're an idiot, Monin,
Greykel said, striking the man above the nose with a well-placed chunk of bread.
It's Hugel. No, it's not. You're just saying that because you think I can't tell the difference between you.
Can you? The man's smirk wavered. Lay interrupted.
How could you possibly say that the destruction of our homeland has helped us?
She had grown increasingly moody as they'd pushed through the mobs of refugees to reach Terrell's tent, and her voice was low and hard. Monin smiled and made a mock bow while seated.
I was beginning to wonder if you could speak or if you were stone-mouthed too. I am Monin Dessel, and this is my brother Hugel.
I am
Lay broke off, catching herself. She had removed her Cannith ring, and her dragon mark was hidden from view.
Leda? A lovely name.
Back off, Dane growled. Lay flushed and glared at Dane before turning to Monin.
You didn't answer my question. How could you possibly believe that the mourning was a good thing?
Monin was distracted by the arrival of the meal. Tribex stew seasoned with celis leaves. Terrell may have considered the meal humble fare, but after 6 months of tasteless gruel, it was a true delight. The twins pounced on the stew like starving men, and it was Terrell who finally answered Lay's question.
There are few people in our community who believe that Seer deserved its fate, he said.
Dane almost dropped his spoon. What?
Hundreds of refugees live in high walls, and each person has a different opinion. The root of this argument is that Seer was weak. Mishan was the rightful heir to the throne of Galifar. If she'd been more aggressive, she might have put down the rebellion before it came to war.
Greykel scowled.
In other words, she should have killed her brothers and sisters instead of trusting them to follow the laws and wishes of their father.
Monan looked up from the stew. Well, they didn't, did they? Hugo laughed.
Remind me, Monin, what did you do during the war?
Hugo stopped laughing and Monan looked away. Greykel smirked, then looked back at Dane.
Speaking of the war, how long are you planning to wear that uniform?
Dane flushed slightly, remembering his conversation with Jode earlier in the day. Why? Was it so easy for you to abandon it? She shrugged.
Wearing a cloak or a pin doesn't change who you are. Seer is still with us, but the nation is gone. The army is gone. All you're doing by wearing that cloak is angering the people you need as friends. And you should know better. You're encouraging a fight when we need to work for peace.
This is a point that Greykel and I don't quite see eye to eye, Terral said. If we let go of our tradition, our unity, what do we have left?
What do we have now?
Greykel was still smiling, but her voice had taken a sharper tone.
Are we going to be the kingdom of tents? You've seen the Moonland. Seer's not coming back. I don't like it any more than you do, but we should be trying to find good lives for our people here in Breland. We need to get our people out of high walls, not rejoice in our isolation.
Monan broke in again. No, this time it was Hugo. We're still a force to be reckoned with. What do you say, Captain? Do you believe the war's over? Is he serious? Dane didn't know what to say.
No offense, Hugo,
Jode said.
but how can you say otherwise? Let's be honest. We were losing the war. Even if every surviving Syrian could wield a weapon, you couldn't field an army capable of standing against Breland. Who said anything about an army?
Hugo's eyes glittered. What then? Dane said.
Have you seen the Moonland?
Hugo asked. Greykel rolled her eyes. Apparently, she'd heard this before. I spent months searching for survivors, Dane replied. Terral, you said you found this serving girl there, didn't you? That's one more survivor than we ever found. Terral stared down into his water, his eyes distant.
There were more in the south, Dane. I myself was in Metrol when the morning came. I'll never forget that night.
If you've seen it, you should know, Hugo said. Seer isn't dead. 'Tis simply changed.
Dane thought back, remembering the corpses that would decay, the burning mist, the rain of blood. I suppose. We can't go back there, Hugo said. The land can't support life. We know that. But it is still our homeland. It is our past and perhaps our path to the future. There is power on Seer. You've seen the wonders and horrors that lie beyond the mist. But if we can harness that power, how could anyone stand against us then?
And what would we do with such a weapon? Grekel asked. Olandra's teeth, Hugel. Our ancestors prided themselves on their skill and wisdom. Alone of the 5 nations, we held true to the dictates of Galifar. Would you spread the Mornland across the entire continent?
The throne of Galifar was ours by right. The others betrayed 1,000 years of tradition, and our homeland paid the price. Do they deserve any better? How about you, Dane? Do you intend to let Seer be forgotten? Dane considered. Eventually, he said, I will never forgive Rowan for her role in starting the war. I don't know if I can ever look at a Brillish soldier and see anything but an enemy. But Seer always stood for peace and for wisdom. We fought to preserve our nation, not out of a desire for conquest or revenge. If we turn against that now, then we will be the ones who truly destroy Seer. There was a long pause. Then Taral clapped his hands. Well said, Captain. Greykill nodded, and even Monin smiled. Hugel inclined his head. Indeed. I hope you'll pardon my outburst. My brother and I enjoy taking the side of the traveler, and sometimes I take things too far. Obviously, it would be madness to spread the Moonland. He smiled. Even if we could unlock the mysteries behind it. Dane studied the twin carefully, looking for any signs of his true thoughts. Had he simply been arguing the side of discord? Greykel was also watching Hugel, and there was nothing but disgust in her eye. The conversation eventually began again. Terrell shared his memories of the court and the last noble queen of Seer, whom he had advised in the final days of the war. The other 2 diners were an elderly half-elf named Saelia and her grandson, Solus. They said little during the meal. Saelia occasionally made comments in the language of the Valinar, and Dane concluded that she didn't speak the common tongue of Galifar. The boy was thin and sickly and picked at his stew. At one point, he coughed, and Dane saw a spot of blood. Jode saw it too and quickly moved over to look at the boy. What is it, Jode? Dane asked.
Flame worms. Fairly advanced. It doesn't look good.
Saelia grabbed the child, pulling him away. Greykill frowned, and Taral nodded gravely. He's not the first, I'm afraid. I know the main wells are clean, but we've lost a number of the children. I'll have Hulda take a look at him. She should be able to ease his pain. Jode looked at Dane, a question in his eyes. Dane nodded. Jode removed the woolen cap he was wearing, revealing the blue and silver spread across his bald head. Taral's eyes widened. My lord, is that? Jode spoke a few words in Saelia's language. Slowly, he pulled the boy away from her embrace and placed his palms on either side of the child's head. The people around the table fell silent, and all eyes were fixed on Jode. The blue of his dragon mark began to glow with an inner light. It only lasted a moment, but it seemed to stretch on far longer. Jode released the boy's head, and the light from his mark faded.
It's going to take a few days for him to recover, he told Saelia. But he'll live.
With that, the spell was broken, and everyone began to talk at once. Taral made his voice heard over the din. Jode, did you just heal that boy? Jode nodded.
Yes, and it's Jode.
So, you are a member of House Jurasko?
Jode shrugged. I bear the mark of healing, but I owe allegiance to no house. He said this so easily that it seemed perfectly natural. Greykill broke in.
This is outstanding! What are your limits? I could think of half a dozen sick children. And then there's Elimer. He's starting to go blind.
Jode looked back to Dane. This was why he'd hidden the mark to begin with, why he'd asked Dane before healing the child. I can only draw so much power before I need to rest, Jode said. Fighting an infection is hard. Harder than fighting a battle. You may have had healers in your other units, but most probably used dragon shards to focus their energy. I suppose I can try to treat the children, but I'll only be able to help one each day. And I can't do anything for this Elimer, I'm afraid. I just don't have that kind of power.
Then I suppose...
Greykill tapped her eye patch. I'm afraid not.
Well, I'm getting used to it. But any sort of help you could provide to the community would be appreciated.
Absolutely, Terrell echoed. This is an unprecedented stroke of good fortune. I had no idea. A free dragon mark right here in our midst.
Dane glanced over at Lei, but she remained silent.
And you, Dane?
Greykill pointed at his sword with the blazing eye of Deneth emblazoned on the pommel.
Do you carry the mark of Sentinel?
Thank you, Captain Grayson, Dane thought. No, he said. I lost my sword during our travels, and this is a gift from a friend. For a time, the conversation turned to the powers and limitations of Jode's dragon mark. Taral was interested in what he could do. Could he restore Olalia's jaw? What sort of parasites could he destroy? Greykill was more interested in the immediate civic applications of his abilities, and Jode agreed to work with the local healer Hulda to try to identify and help those refugees with the most serious problems. After the meal was done, Saelia thanked Jode again and took her grandson off to bed. One of the twins left. Dane couldn't remember which one it was. Looking across the table, he noticed that Lei and the other twin were still deep in conversation. A little too deep for his tastes. Monin, Dane said, shouldn't you be going now? The man laughed, a sound Dane was beginning to hate. It's Hugel. He put a hand on Lei's shoulder. And it's such a lovely conversation. We must be going, Dane said. Lei, Jode. One moment, Jode said. Counselor Terrell, if I may ask, you are fairly familiar with the comings and goings of high walls, yes? Terrell nodded.
Why do you ask?
Have you seen this man, by any chance? Jode produced one of Alina's sketches, folded to hide the writing. He pushed it to the center of the table, and both Hugel and Terrell examined it. His name is Raciel.
Is he Sharn?
Terrell said, frowning. No, Brullish. But he had a family in Seer. One of his cousins served in our unit and died at Keldon Ridge. We just need to deliver a message. Terrell studied the parchment for a moment.
No, I'm afraid I can't help you.
Hugel just shook his head and laughed.
He does look somewhat familiar, Greykill said. Are you sure you haven't seen him, Hugel?
The twin shrugged.
Perhaps it was Monin then.
Well, it was worth a try. Jode picked up the sheet of parchment and stood up. Shall we, my friends? Greykill stood, and without warning, she wrapped Dane in a crushing embrace. She had the strength of a bear. "Well met, Dane, Lay, Jode. I'll expect to see you tomorrow." After he'd caught his breath, Dane nodded. "Good night, Captain. And thank you again, Lord Terral. Let me know if we can be of service."
"Don't worry, Dane. I certainly shall."
The 4 soldiers gathered their belongings. The serving girl, Eulalia, had emerged to clear the table, and Dane noticed that she was staring at Jode. Her marble teeth glittered in the torchlight, and then she disappeared behind a flap of cloth.